Welcome into Fantasy Pros. This is the Fantasy Football Podcast. Tera Roberts here along with Pat Fitzmaurice and Billy Muzio, and today is our ranking show. We will be going through the Fantasy Pros tiers for rankings for week 3 for wide receivers. Billy and Pat will be providing their thoughts on players in each tier, and there is no better pair to provide analysis on rankings because Billy was the number 4 overall most accurate in-season fantasy football ranker in 2022 and has consistently done well in our accuracy competition. Fitz was the most accurate in-season weekly ranker in 2020 and has also been consistently among the most accurate rankers in fantasy football. You can find Billy at FF Muzio and Pat at Fitz_FF, and you can find me at It's Tera Time. Before we get started, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. And we're going to go ahead and dive right in to the wide receiver rankings. As a reminder, guys, the consensus rankings can be found at fantasypros.com/rankings. So make sure that you go there after the show today to dive right in. And we'll start off with the S tier. It is a very solid tier, honestly. And it's got a lot of fantastic players in it. The S tier starts off with Justin Jefferson, 11 receptions on 13 targets and 159 yards. It's just another typical day for Justin Jefferson in his S tier as he leads it off, as he always does. Then we've got Tyreek Hill. This was more like a Tyreek Hill floor week. 5 receptions on 9 targets, 40 yards, a touchdown against New England. A tough matchup, but it's Tyreek Hill. He pulled through for us. Stephon Diggs, 7 of 7 for 66 yards. A.J. Brown, 6.9 fantasy points. He is wide receiver 44 right now. Now, this will be very interesting for us to talk about as well, comparing him to Devonta Smith. And then rounding out the S tier, CeeDee Lamb, 11 receptions, 13 targets, 143 yards against the Jets, a very difficult matchup. Could you be more locked in? Fantastic performance. And obviously we want to pull out here A.J. Brown as a guy that I want Billy and Pat to kind of discuss over because you guys, are kind of feeling the same thing here. ECR has him at wide receiver 4. Pat, you've got him at wide receiver 8. Billy, you've got him at wide receiver 7. Pat, what are your feelings? Are you worried about this start for A.J. Brown?
Not worried. Had a touchdown taken away in week 2 when a holding penalty by Rashad Penny nullified it. We did see A.J. Brown sort of giving Jalen Hurts the business on the sideline. Maybe he gets the squeaky wheel treatment this week. I guess the reason I have him behind ECR is just that I don't think there's much of a gap between A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith, which is really, I'm not... nothing damning about A.J. Brown's performances. I just think Devonta Smith is pretty terrific too. So I've got them adjacent in my rankings this week, 8 and 9.
Billy, how about you?
Yeah, I in lockstep here with Pat. We're seeing a 30.8% target share from A.J. Brown, which is outstanding. But on the flip side, we're seeing a 28.8% target share from Devonta Smith. So there's literally a 1A, 1B situation now in Philadelphia. And when we take a look at the implied total, Tampa Bay against Tampa Bay, 45.5. Game script probably not going to be in the passing game's benefit. So this is going to be benefiting Swift more than it is A.J. Brown or Devonta Smith. But I just don't think that he's going to be able to get to that top 4, top 3 spot based upon this game script and what we're going to expect to see here for the Philadelphia game. So slightly behind ADP. Agree with Pat here with the competition of targets with Devonta Smith.
I agree with you guys. I mean, we were drafting it as such. This is no surprise here. It was a 1A, 1B. They're very close in terms of players, wide receivers that are realistically both wide receiver 1s in terms of where they could finish. Let's dive into the A tier here. Another fantastic tier. We've got some names here that are typically S tier kind of players, but have fallen off a little bit, just a little bit. I mean, they're still A tier. They're still fantastic. We start off with Amon-Ra St. Brown, over 100 yards in week 2. Jamar Chase, oh man, second sub 10 fantasy point performance. And we've got the potential injury to deal with the calf from Joe Burrow. So we've got some fantasy managers kind of worrying around him, but he's still in the A tier because he is Jamar Chase. And we've got Devontae Adams, who bounced back fantastically with a nice 20 fantasy point performance this past week. We've got Devonta Smith, who we just talked about again. He's wide receiver 7 through 2 games. He is in the A tier, locked in. Calvin Ridley coming off of a disappointing performance, but again, it was a tough Kansas City defensive matchup, 5.2 fantasy points per game. We expect to bounce back from him. And Keenan Allen as well against Tennessee. Fantastic performance against that Tennessee defense. Lit up the secondary. Justin Herbert did. 8 receptions for Keenan Allen, over 100 yards, 2 touchdowns. Chris Olave also in this tier, coming off of a solid game. 6 receptions on 11 targets, 86 yards. And then Puka Nacua setting records through his first 2 games. I mean, our rookie Puka Nacua, 15 receptions, 20 targets, absolute insanity, nearly 150 yards. This man is like this Cooper Kupp light, not even light. He is the Cooper Kupp replacement, already jumping into the A tier as a rookie. Insane. But let's talk about a second-year player who got off to a fantastic start last year, Chris Olave. We're going to pull him out and discuss him here. Last week's performance, it was all right. He could have done a little bit better, as we were expecting for our wide receiver 1. But let's talk about the rankings here. ECR has him at wide receiver 12. Pat, you have him at wide receiver 13. And then wide receiver 4 for Billy. Billy, why don't you start us off here? Because I love Olave, and clearly you do.
Yeah, I love Olave. Not going to lie. This one kind of shocked me when I was looking at where he came out in the projections. His name circled on the sheet right now for somebody I need to take a deeper look at as the week progresses. So there's the disclaimer. That being said, the analytics are looking great for him right now. On the season, we've seen over a 30% target share. We've seen a target rate of 32.3%. He's number 10 in the league in targets right now currently. He's number 8 in the league in air yards. He's number 6 in the league in deep targets, number 7 in the league in receptions, and number 2 in the league in their yards at the catch the first 2 weeks. So got to love the usage. Matchup isn't great, but he will not be shadowed by Jerry Alexander. As Pat and I were discussing off air, that he runs in the slot quite a bit, and so we're not going to see that shadow here in week 3, which is good news for Olave from a fantasy perspective. So I'll definitely take a look at the ranking, but I definitely like the usage, and I think that this is within the realm of possibilities.
I agree. I mean, what we're seeing out of him has been absolutely fantastic. I would expect a nice bounce back game from Miller. I don't think it's good to look at it, but I don't think you're that far off in your analysis there and your numbers. Diving into the B tier. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah, I agree with Billy. Olave is awesome, and I don't think he's going to get a lot of Jair Alexander coverage this week. But I do wonder, with the injury issues the Saints are dealing with at running back with Jamal Williams' hamstring injury. We're getting reports that Kendre Miller is probably going to be back this week, which is good. But I do wonder if we see maybe a little more wildcat from the Saints with Taysom Hill at quarterback, which maybe just lowers the ceiling a little bit for all of their wide receivers. So that's maybe why I'm a little lower on Olave than Billy is. But I'm still pretty enthusiastic about Billy's high ranking for him since I'm so heavily invested with Olave.
Love it. Me too. You mentioned Kendre Miller. I feel like it's the perfect transition to talk about something else. It's fall. It's football season. And whether you're watching football in the backyard or doing my personal favorite, tailgating at a college football game, there's only one thing that makes it better. It's adding Miller Lite. Miller Lite is the 96-calorie beer that tastes like beer and is perfectly brewed for everything fall has to offer. Miller Lite is the perfect light beer for all beer lovers. As soon as you take a sip, that day the conversation with friends is just instantly better. Whether you're watching a game at home or watching outside of a stadium, live those autumn moments with Miller Lite and let the great taste of Miller Lite hit your taste buds so hard you feel it in your heart. With a Miller Lite in your hands, fall doesn't just taste great, it tastes like Miller time. To get Miller Lite delivered right to your door, visit MillerLite.com/FantasyPros. That's MillerLite.com/FantasyPros. Or you can find it pretty much anywhere that sells beer. Celebrate responsibly. Miller Brewing Company, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 96 calories and 3.2 carbs per 12 ounces. All right, let's jump us into the B tier here. Jalen Waddle leads off the B tier. Coming off of a 12.4 fantasy point performance, again, that tough matchup that we saw against the New England defense, but he is dealing with a concussion. Fantasy managers need to monitor his progress on that. DK Metcalf, another injury concern as well with the rib injuries. So monitor that. He had a surprisingly good game considering that he was in and out of the lineup with the injury. 6 receptions, 6 targets, 75 yards. T. Higgins with the big bounce back game in the B tier. 8 receptions. 12 targets, 2 touchdowns. There he is. Hopefully he can continue that, and Jamar Chase in our A tier can also bounce back as well. Then we've got Deebo Samuel. Brandon Ayuk dealing with a shoulder injury. 5 carries. Fantastic for 38 yards. Touchdown. He also added 6 receptions, 63 yards. Mike Williams had a fine boom game, and then Mike Evans continues his dominating performance. 171 yards, 1 touchdown. We don't really have any big differing opinions here in this tier. So we'll go ahead and dive into the C tier where we've got a couple things that we got to talk about. Okay. We start off with Tyler Lockett, who is rarely super controversial with people that love him. 8 receptions, 10 targets, 2 touchdowns. He's Tyler Lockett. He just continues to thrive. Garrett Wilson, surprisingly, 1 huge play saved the day for him. So not a bad performance sitting in the C tier this week. Then we have Amari Cooper ended up playing. Despite the fact that he was dealing with an injury, he had a solid game. 7 receptions, 90 yards. George Pickens with the strong game. 4 receptions, 10 targets. Kenny Pickett a little off, but again, the big yardage, touchdown, 18 fantasy point performance in the absence of Deontay Johnson. Brandon Ayuk, we mentioned dealing with that shoulder injury, is also sitting in this tier. Then we've got Chris Godwin. Another 10-point fantasy performance, perhaps his floor, perhaps there's some higher upside coming. I don't know. I think we might talk about it in a second. Michael Pittman Jr., one of my personal favorites, another strong performance, 8 receptions, 12 targets. DJ Moore, we called it right here on this exact show a week ago. Bounce back game for DJ Moore out of the clutches of Jair Alexander. 6 receptions on 7 targets for 100 yards. Fantastic. All right, let's dive into this C tier because this is a little bit of a controversial tier here. We've got, let's start off with Amari Cooper. Pat, you have got him at wide receiver 16. Billy, wide receiver 18. ECR, wide receiver 23. What's going on with ECR? Why are they a little bit off? Pat, tell us about why we are buying into Amari Cooper this week.
Yeah, I mean, he was questionable with a groin injury in week 2. Not only did he play, he played really well. 10 targets, 7 catches for 90 yards, and some of those catches were high degree of difficulty catches. So great matchup against the Titans this week. I mean, the Titans have just been getting crushed in the passing game now for 2 straight years. I think they gave up the most fantasy points to wide receivers last year. They're already giving up the 3rd most fantasy points, 3rd most yards, and 2nd most receptions to wide receivers this year. Maybe they get cornerback Christian Fulton and safety Amani Hooker back from injury this year or this week. Maybe not. And they both missed week 2. So I mean, whether they come back or not, the Titans' pass defense is one we want to target. And, you know, Cooper is still the alpha receiver in the Browns' passing attack.
Billy, how about you?
Yeah, death, taxes, and Amari Cooper being underrated at fantasy football go hand in hand every year. And I agree with Pat. This matchup is juicy for the receivers in Cleveland. I know that Deshaun Watson has looked like a shell of himself yet again. That being said, Amari Cooper is seeing just a ton of work. 30.4% target rate on the season, 24% target share on the season. One of the better route runners in the NFL and is always going to be able to separate from a receiver. We said last week, well, I didn't think he was going to play last week based upon that late groin injury addition to the injury report, but he played through it and still saw double-digit targets. And so I expect to see him outperform expectations here in week 3 again.
Yeah, we talked about this matchup, this Tennessee matchup, when we talked about running backs. It's funny. You look at this matchup against Tennessee and you're like, okay, obviously Amari Cooper going to light it up, be fantastic, but we've seen some disappointment from Deshaun Watson, not looking like the player that we expected him to be. Pat, are there any concerns around Deshaun Watson potentially holding Amari Cooper back?
Possibly. I don't think the Deshaun Watson of 2020 is coming back. Like, we've just seen enough now that I think the I don't know if it's playing more in structure with the Browns than he did with the Texans. That's sort of not suiting his skill set, but he just does not look like the same player. So while I think he can be, he can get the Browns where they want to go because the rest of that roster is so good, but I don't know if he can be the weekly no-brainer starter for fantasy managers that he once was.
Makes sense. What about you, Billy? Concerns around Deshaun Watson? Does that make you? Would it be Amari Cooper, underrated as you mentioned, to the moon, higher expectations, or is Deshaun just kind of, is he going to be an issue here?
I think Deshaun is definitely a concern at this point. He's not going to live up to the draft hype that he had in the offseason. He definitely kind of steamed up again as we approach drafting season. But as their struggles continue, there's one thing for sure, that he continues to lean into Amari Cooper. And if they continue to struggle, they'll probably be in game scripts that are going to favor the passing game, which will, even if we're getting garbage time, that's good for the receivers and fantasy output, but not necessarily great for Deshaun Watson. So I think that although I do have concerns, I think that Amari Cooper is probably going to be fairly safe throughout the process.
Before we move on to the next tier, we've got another player within this exact tier that we've got some controversy around here. Chris Godwin, ECR, wide receiver 25. Pat, you've got him wide receiver 24. You're right on there with ECR. And Billy, you're not feeling positively about Chris Godwin. We've got him at wide receiver 32 for you. I mentioned those statistics. He's just hovering around 10 fantasy points per game. We've got top 5 Mike Evans checking in here. What are the concerns for you around Chris Godwin?
There's a lot of concerns this week. Let's start at the big picture first. Mike Evans just seems to be the favorite target for Baker Mayfield at a 28.1% target share this season, where Chris Godwin has settled in about 21.9%. And then we got the matchup here in week 3 against Philadelphia. Not an easy matchup. And I think that Tampa has looked good to this point, but I think the realization sets in this week when they face a stout defense in Philadelphia. I like the overall usage for Chris Godwin, but he just hasn't really separated himself from the rest of the pack. Wide receiver 40 up to the season in fantasy points per game currently. Target rate is low at 16.7%. And overall targets just in general are low at 14, which is wide receiver 38. Not seeing any air yards, and that's not normally his game, but yards after the catch as well. Not seeing much any in that regard, only at 12 yards after the catch so far for the season. And so I don't know if it's just a chemistry thing with Baker right now, or if it's Godwin potentially losing a step as he's now almost 28 years old. But there are some concerns for the season-long outlook for Chris Godwin if Mike Evans continues to be this kind of apple of the eye of Baker Mayfield.
Pat, I mentioned Mike Evans, and he's checking in at a top 5 receiver. Chris Godwin is sitting literally on the opposite end. They're so far off of where they, have typically been in terms of wide receiver finishes recently. Are you seeing, in your opinion, are you feeling more confident that Chris Godwin is going to be able to recover and push more towards that wide receiver 2 territory?
Yeah, I'm wondering if maybe this doesn't set up as a better Godwin game than an Evans game. I mean, the Eagles' defense last year their pass rush was the best in the league, and it was historically good. I mean, I think they had the most sacks of anyone since like the 1984 Chicago Bears. And I think Baker Mayfield is going to want to get the ball out quickly, and that would seem to favor Godwin playing from the slot more than Evans. I also think the coverage is going to favor Godwin here because whereas, the Eagles have those outside cornerbacks, Darius Slay and James Bradbury, I think Godwin's going to be running most of his routes against second-year undrafted free agent Mario Goodrich. So this does seem like a pretty good setup for Godwin relative to Evans. Maybe he gets a little bit more of the target share this week.
Moving on to the D tier, we've got Terry McLaurin, who seems to have the upper hand based off last week over Jahan Dotson. 16 fantasy point performance. Nice little game for him. Zay Flowers, tough day, but pulled through with some decent yardage, 62 yards, 4 receptions. Nico Collins, wide receiver 6 through 2 games, 31 fantasy point performance. I mean, the Texans are terrible, but that passing offense is rolling and moving forward. DeAndre Hopkins, 8 fantasy points, was dealing with an injury, so maybe that had a little bit something to do with it. A little bit disappointing performance from him. Drake London, surprise, strong performance against Jair Alexander. 6 receptions, 7 targets, 67 yards, 1 touchdown. And then rounding out the D tier, Jerry Jeudy. We're going to give him a little bit of a pass here, back from his injury. First game back, 5.5 fantasy points. He can do a little bit better, but he is sitting in the D tier. No disagreements really here. You guys are pretty locked on the same points of view here. We're going to move on to the E tier here, where we do have somebody that we want to talk about in particular. First guy in the E tier is Jahan Dotson. Again, we talked about this just now with Terry McLaurin. His second sub 10 fantasy point performance. Disappointing, hoping for a little bit of a bounce back here. Jordan Addison also in the E tier. And again, receptions haven't been super high, but the yards, the touchdowns, he's had a touchdown in every single game this season, the first 2 games, doing fantastic. Then we've got Michael Thomas. Strong performance, 7 receptions, 55 yards. Christian Kirk, a huge bounce back game for him, over 100 yards. And then Christian Watson rounding out the E tier. We're just hoping that he's going to play this week. We're crossing our fingers here. But I want to talk about and pull out. We love talking about the rookies. Let's pull out Jordan Addison here and talk about him. ECR has him. This will be a fun one for us. ECR has him at wide receiver 35. Pat, you've got him at wide receiver 42. Billy, you've got him at wide receiver 50. You guys, talk me through it. Pat, you can start me off here. What are you guys seeing in Jordan Addison this week?
Yeah, I think Billy and I both see that the surface stats are better than the underlying usage numbers for Jordan Addison. 7 catches, 133 yards on 11 targets so far, and he scored a touchdown in each of his first 2 games. But his snap share in week 1 was 56%. He played 22 fewer snaps than KJ Osborne. In week 2, Addison had a higher snap share, 69%, but he still played 16 fewer snaps than KJ Osborne. Osborne's out there in 2 receiver sets. Addison is not. The usage just doesn't point to Addison being a top 40 wide receiver. And now I do like him maybe a little more than Billy does because, one, I think Addison is good. And the matchup is kind of a plum matchup this week against the Chargers in what could be a shootout game. So, yeah, I think Addison is flex-worthy this week, but I don't have him inside wide receiver 3 territory like ECR does.
Billy, talk us through it. Talk us through the disappointment and potential performance for Jordan Addison.
Yeah, this is one that could really actually make a rankings week or really hurt a rankings week just because Pat's absolutely right. The usage just has not been there. Addison has seen 13.1% of the target share season to date, where in comparison, like Justin Jefferson's seen 29.8%, KJ Osborne has seen 14.3%, TJ Hawkinson has seen 20.2%. So he's number 4 in the pecking order, just based on the receivers. And if you work in Alexander Madison, who's really close to him, things could shift on a week-to-week basis based upon who's 4 or number 5 in the pecking order. And so I am just not sold on how much we've seen a usage out of him. His touchdown rate at 28.5% is unsustainable. And if he doesn't get those touchdowns, then we're talking about receiver 40 through 50 on a weekly basis. So that being said, it is the highest over-under of the week. So I don't like that going for me in comparison to where I have him being ranked right now. The total's at 53.5. Implied total for them in Minnesota right now is at 26.5. And so, I probably need to take a look at where I have him projected for touchdown rate, but I've given him a bump inside of the spreadsheet at 10%, which is really high, but 28.5%, probably need to up it to 13 or 14% and see where he comes out. But he's one of those guys that I just haven't been able to kind of settle in on the projections just because he's kind of breaking the model, quite frankly, with the touchdown rate. And I'm going to have to kind of hone in on the details. So this is not a finalized ranking, but in terms of usage, to Pat's point, the usage has not been there and it's not great.
It's tough. He's such a promising young talent, but there's so, you hate to say there's mouths to feed, but there really are. We're talking about the overall wide receiver 1, the guy we were drafting as the first player off the board in our fantasy drafts. We're talking about one of the more reliable tight end, possibly the most reliable tight end thus far, a guy that we can depend on in TJ Hawkinson. And you mentioned KJ Osborne, he's shown a lot of promise in the past and pulling through. So it's just so tough. The only benefit here is that the run game has been horrific. But let's dive into hopefully not so horrific, the F tier here for wide receivers. Gabe Davis kicking us off here. He came off of he's in the F tier, but he's coming off that nice boom game, that Gabe Davis signature boom game, 21 fantasy points. Elijah Moore also here. We talked about Amari Cooper earlier. The targets were there for Elijah Moore last week. 9 targets, only 3 receptions though, and 36 yards. Disappointing performance. Tutu Atwell also in the F tier. I don't know if anyone would have predicted that Tutu Atwell would have been in any tier prior to this fantasy season, but here we are, wide receiver 16. So thus far, 15 fantasy points last week. Romeo Doubs, tough day, tough matchup. Then we've also got Marquise Brown, who had a good bounce back performance there with 6 receptions, got the touchdown. Cortland Sutton, a little bit of an average day for him. Rashid Shaheed, productive as the wide receiver 3 for the Saints. 4 receptions, 63 yards. Treylon Burks, I don't know if we can call it a bounce back. It was better than it was before. We're seeing a little bit increased involvement from him, 10 fantasy points. And then rounding out our F tier, Sky Moore with the bounce back game after driving us absolutely crazy in week 1. In week 2, as we all set him on our bench, he gave our bench a fantastic 3 receptions, 70-yard, and touchdown performance here. Let's talk about Sky Moore because why would we not? Come on, it's Sky Moore and these wide receivers here in Kansas City. Controversial, as always. And one of the best offenses in the league. But we've got ECR, wide receiver 47. And then Pat and Billy, again, this one's kind of similar to Jordan Addison. You guys are both down on him a little bit in rankings. Pat, you're at wide receiver 53. Pat, you've got him at wide receiver 62. Or Billy, you've got him at wide receiver 62. So, Billy, why don't you start us off here with wide receiver 62 to 47. What are you expecting from Sky Moore? Is it the lack of consistency in the way that we just can't really rely on him thus far?
Yeah, it's a lack of consistency. It's also just a lack of usage altogether. He's not the receiver we thought he was going to be so far through the first 2 weeks of the season. Target share at 9.2% on the season, which is wide receiver 89. Only 7 targets yet to date, or season to date on 2023, which is wide receiver 77. Snap share only at 70.8%, which is wide receiver number 60. Target rate at 10%, which is wide receiver number 87. And route participation, only 76.9% of routes for the first 2 weeks, which is wide receiver number 62. Not seeing any air yards, wide receiver 81 in the air yard category at 7.9%. Air yard share. Air yards total 73, wide receiver 73 at 28. And so the usage is alarming right now. There is a development with Kadarius Toney and an injury, so that will definitely change things. Should he sit as a rough projection right now, looking like if he does sit, it looks like Sky Moore will be bumped up to about wide receiver 39 in my projections. But if he's out there playing, I should say, Kadarius Toney, then I'd say that Sky Moore is going to float in this 55 to 60 range come game time. So not entirely sold on Sky Moore so far throughout the season. There's just the ball's being moved around the field, and the game script against Chicago is not setting up nicely for Sky Moore altogether for this week as well.
Pat, how about you?
Yeah, great point with Billy on the suboptimal usage for Sky Moore. I mean, he's just not commanding targets at the rate we would like to see, and he's not on the field all the time. So I guess the one thing he does have going for him is that Patrick Mahomes is his quarterback. Actually make that 2 things because he's got a great matchup against the Bears, whose pass defense has just been trash this year. The Bears have no pass rush whatsoever. So maybe he's going to have time to finally get open and draw some targets this week.
All right, that wraps up our wide receiver ranking show. If you want a chance to win a signed Deebo Samuel San Francisco 49ers jersey, courtesy of bettingpros.com, your place to start betting smarter and not harder, you need to subscribe to the Fantasy Pros YouTube channel right now. Comment below on this video, and that's it. We'll be announcing the winner right here on the channel, so make sure you turn on those notifications so you can be alerted when new episodes are up and to claim your prize. If you want to see more advice from Pat, just go check out his rankings. Go to fantasypros.com/fits. You can find Billy on Twitter at FFMuzio. You can find Pat on Twitter at Fitz_FF. And you can find me there too at It's Tera Time. And make sure to check out Billy's work on Player Profiler as well. And if you have any questions about lineups or trades, we are live each and every Thursday on YouTube at 3 p.m. EST, 12 p.m. PST, taking your questions. For Pat Fitzmaurice, for Billy Muzio, I'm Tera Roberts. Thank you for tuning in.